a little bit of change of gears now. We're going to hear from 4 academics that are currently doing research related to the hospital to share a little bit more of that history. So I'd like to welcome up to the stage Maureen Lux. Maureen is going to share a little bit about the building and the hospital that exists. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you all. I too want to acknowledge and honor the Treaty 6 nations and the Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory for centuries, and of course to honor those who spent time at the hospital and those who never made it home. But what I've spent the last 10 years or so researching Indian hospitals in Canada. And for this presentation, I wanted to do something about the Camsell, and to kind of, it's kind of out of step because I'm going to look at the eventual demise of what was called the new Camsell Hospital in 1967. So the image you see is the original Jesuit college, as it was called, being demolished, and the new hospital built in 1967 in the background. But what I want to look at is how this new Camsell Hospital, opened in 1967, became caught up in the nasty politics of Medicare, and how that dispute between governments, federal Liberals and Alberta Conservatives, directly damaged the interests of the Indigenous people that the hospital was meant to serve. So by the early 1960s, Indian Health Service hoped to shut down most of the 22 or so Indian hospitals it had established in the 1930s and 40s. But there were other plans for the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital. Instead, this hospital was going to be rebuilt. So there's the original Jesuit College, converted into the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital in 1945. So certainly this hospital is showing its age by the 1960s. This is the front view, and this is the rear view. So the brick building I showed you in the first slide, it's on the left of this image. And what you're seeing there is an aerial view of all these wooden buildings that became the wards of the hospital. And certainly these tinder-dry wooden buildings were a constant fire threat. They were from the 1940s and certainly by the 1960s. And the large dormitory-style wards that were suitable for a military installation were completely unsuitable for a hospital treating men, women, and children. Nevertheless, that was the setup, and there was dangerous cross-infection throughout the history of this hospital. But the Camsell Hospital wasn't like the other Indian hospitals. So this is the original view I showed you. The Camsell Hospital had a very intimate connection with the University of Alberta's medical school. So the medical school provided student doctors and specialist consultants. The hospital, of course, provided what was called interesting clinical material, which means patients to study. So Camsell Hospital is different for that reason. Secondly, Camsell Hospital was different because the senior nursing and administrative staff were remarkably loyal. Many had been there since 1945 when it opened. Many lived on campus. There was housing for staff on campus. And thirdly, Camsell Hospital was the very public face of bold government efforts highlighted in the press often of pilots and staff rescuing grateful Northerners. So it was a very important hospital for the personal and professional interests of Dr. Percy Moore, who was the director of Indian Health Services and had worked with Indian Health Services throughout his career. Moore actually officiated at the official sod turning for the new hospital in 1964, calling it, and just months before his retirement, calling it, quote, the happiest day of my life. So it was an important building for the bureaucracy in particular. The new hospital opened in 1967, dropped Indian from its name, so it became known as the Charles Camsell Hospital, not Charles Camsell Indian Hospital. And it was celebrated as, quote, a centennial gift from southern Canada to the north. Northerners might have asked then why it was actually in the south and not in the north. Nevertheless, soon after it was opened, it became seriously underused. There was, because of steadily falling TB rates and the expansion of facilities in the north. So to keep beds full, the federal government allowed local doctors in Edmonton admitting privileges to the hospital. So it developed quickly in the late 60s and into the 1970s into an Edmonton community hospital, where fewer than a quarter of the patients were actually Indigenous. At the same time, the Edmonton provincial government had serious political disagreements with the federal Liberals over Medicare, established in 1968. So as a result, the Alberta Hospital Services Commission, who essentially paid for hospital care in the province, and they paid on a per patient, per day rate, or per diem rate. And it would, Alberta Hospital Services would only pay the Camsell Hospital $78 per diem rate, while other city hospitals were paid $125 per diem rate. So this meant that the Indian Health Services, which owned the hospital, subsidized what became basically a general city hospital to the tune of $3 million annually. So in 1972, Indian Health Services was prepared to give the hospital to the province for $1, plus what it called a $3 million transitional grant, or essentially the 1 year's deficit. The Alberta government declined the offer. Finally, by 1980, a transfer agreement was reached, and National Health Minister Monique Béjean announced a $2.5 million gift to fund an Indian Healthcare Commission in Alberta. Now, as the only new and modern Indian hospital, the Charles Camsell primarily benefited non-Indigenous people of Edmonton, who made up the majority of its patients. And over the decade of the 1970s, had accumulated a deficit of $25 million. Add to that the $7 million it took to originally build the new building. That takes it to $32 million, or in today's dollars, more than $200 million. That money was intended for the health care of Indigenous people, funds earmarked for those who needed it most. Instead, it was spent on non-Indigenous patients, who were the majority of the hospital's clientele. Essentially, money intended for the care of Indigenous people filled the coffers of Alberta, the nation's wealthiest province. One then could be forgiven for viewing with cynicism the Health Minister Béjean's 1980 gift of $2.5 million, or less than 1 year's deficit. So by 1996, the province closed and abandoned the Charles Camsell Hospital, in part due to asbestos contamination. The derelict building on its 11-acre site became a frightening place. It sits fenced, boarded, and scrawled with graffiti, a nasty, nagging neighborhood eyesore, according to the press. Because it became a general hospital in Edmonton, people, many in Edmonton who were born there, who spent time there, have no idea what it was. They have no idea why it was there. They have no idea who it was intended to help. And of course, no idea who actually paid for it. It's a shameful and sorry end for a place that had such a profound impact, for good or ill, on so many. Like the building itself, its history for Indigenous people was abandoned and forgotten. Thank you.